from a wildlife perspective, it would be highly beneficial to just have a good amount of diversity, not only in your fields or food plots, right? Because you don't want to just have a monoculture of, say, brassicas, but you also probably don't want just legumes, right? And having that diversity on your farm or on your property that the wildlife could so they can go in as a ruminant and they can eat on maple buds or they can eat in a CRP field, having some of those natural forms as well to kind of let them figure out as a concentrate selector how they need to balance the rumen. Would you think that's a fair assessment?
Yes, and I'm glad you talked about the natural stuff too. Like I said, kind of getting ready to have this discussion, I started trying to read about food plots, and you're trying to attract them to your property for many reasons. In doing so, you don't want to just clear out everything that's natural. Like I said, those browsers, they need those tannins just as much as they need fiber for healthy, like ruminant health. So throwing out a bucket of corn, you can cause acidosis. Removing those, maple buds and the natural things that they would browse on, you're taking out those tannins that, their saliva binds some, but it also keeps others. And the saliva for the ruminant, it provides a buffer, and it helps maintain that pH. So that's why we need fiber. But the tannin part is also very interesting. And then in the livestock world, we're starting to look at that, where we used to think tannins, they cause digestive upset. They're, animal health, we don't want to deal with them. Now we're seeing, well, actually at a low limited level, that can help us reduce our odds of having bloat with, like alfalfa and clover. When you're thinking of deer plots, you need to make sure that they still have access to some of what they're naturally going to be eating.
Hey guys, Al here. I wanted to dive into the ruminant digestion. So I was able to interview an animal scientist, which if you're watching this, you'll be able to watch that for the next hour and some time there. And we will dive into how the rumen works, and also the key takeaway is the importance of balance, not only for cattle, but obviously for other ruminant animals like the white-tailed deer. So whether you're implementing livestock on your farm or you're an active wildlife farmer/manager, I hope you find this information interesting as I talk to Rebecca from Ward Labs, an animal scientist. All right, guys. Well, this is Albert with Vitalized Seed, and I am here with Rebecca of Ward Labs, and I'm going to let Rebecca introduce herself. Anybody who's watching this on Ward's channel, just real quick, I'm Albert with Vitalized Seed. We started about 3 years ago as a business and have worked with Ward Labs for all of our soil and tissue testing needs since the beginning. So I'm so excited to finally sit down and do a webinar. We talk about Ward all the time. I've talked to Ryan and previously Patrick and so many others, even Dr. Ray Ward a couple of times. And I'm so excited to have Rebecca on the phone here or on the YouTube video here to talk about a whole bunch of things. So Rebecca, introduce yourself, please.
So I'm Rebecca Kern-Lundberry. I'm the professional animal scientist here at Ward Labs. My background is in beef cattle, but my undergraduate degree, I did minor in zoology. So I took some comparative environmental physiology classes. So I do have some ground to stand on when we talk about deer and some wildlife habitat types of things. And I've actually even looked at some of our CRP data and kind of like me and Albert were talking before we started recording, talking about drawing the connections and connecting lines. So tying some of our forage quality data actually to wildlife habitats has been really fun. And I'm really lucky to work here at Ward Labs, where we do try to serve mainly agricultural producers, but a big part of that is managing our lands. And we in America, we love our wildlife. That's why we have our national parks and different wildlife sanctuaries and stuff like that. So it's really fun to get to be a part of that and work directly with the livestock producers and land managers who are really responsible for keeping us on track with all of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it's great. I mean, you guys do such a great job and have so many experts in the field. And that's really why I wanted to talk to you. So, for everybody listening, I was pestering Rebecca with a bunch of emails back and forth discussing different things. And I've done this to a bunch of folks at Ward over the years. And I'm always looking to learn, and there's so much information and so much data out there. And even the most brilliant people out there might have varying opinions, and I think that what I wanted to do today is go over high level some things, dive into the weeds on a couple others, and really get a better understanding for those people out there, who are whether they have a small hobby farm, because at Vitalize we do work with some small farmers, whether it be flower farmers and they have some livestock that they're incorporating into their situation, and or a lot of people in more wildlife settings who are doing food plots and things like that. But just have a better understanding, like how does the ruminant, excuse me, work? What can we do? Should I be buying that bag of protein feed off the Tractor Supply shelf for my deer? Is that really going to make an impact if I put 50 pounds down, or does it need to be 500,000 pounds? Right? Like, what type of things can we do? Specifically, learning more about the physiology of the deer, and obviously correlating that to your research with cattle and things, and how that might be interesting to our users. So, if it's okay with you, I have some questions and I'd love to just kind of start and go through those and work through
Yeah,
them.
let's go for it.
Sound good? So, first question right off the bat, at a high level, so, 30,000 foot view, what is a ruminant? How does it work?
Yep. So, perfect question. So, ruminant nutrition 101. So, a ruminant animal is an animal that has a four-chambered stomach. And so, our main livestock that I work with, beef cattle, four-chambered stomach. And then you've got wildlife that also have four-chambered stomach, antelope, deer, um, moose, elk, all of these are ruminant animals. When we look at our domestic species, we have cattle, which are grazers. We have sheep and goats, which sheep are considered intermediate. So they're somewhere between a grazer and a browser. And then we have our browsers. Goats are the only true domesticated livestock species that is a browser. But then most of our native uh, wildlife that are ruminant species are browsers. So that's our deer, pronghorn. Pronghorn are especially good at browsing. That's why they can survive off sagebrush. And then moose. And so what's really interesting when we look at the anatomy and physiology of a ruminant, when we're talking about the grazers, typically they have, a wide mouth, a very, they're just using that big, strong tongue, pulling in as much forage as they can. And they kind of are moving slowly through that field, just grabbing, and they're a lot less selective. When we look at our browsers, consider the muzzle on a deer, a goat. Everyone except for that moose has a very small, narrow muzzle, and they have really flexible lips. They can practically separate their lips like fingers and pick out exactly what they want to eat. They're going to pick out those berries, those buds, those branches, all of that. So that's where we start thinking about a ruminant, is how they're eating and that kind of behavior. And then when we move into the saliva, we see another difference between our browsers versus our grazers. So the saliva of your browser has something that can bind up tannins. So that's why antelope and deer and goats, they all can survive eating a lot of buds and leaves off trees and things like that actually cause a problem and are on they cause animal health issues and declining ruminant health when a grazer consumes them, because they don't have those chemical properties in their saliva. So then we move through that, they've taken their bites, whatnot. So then we move into that four compartmented stomach, which is what we really think about for ruminant species. So the first compartment is the reticulum, and this is what they call the honeycomb. And essentially anything that's heavy and really large, big particles fall into that. So you might hear of cattle eating magnets, and that's because if they happen to grab, they're out there grabbing what they can. If they happen to pull a wire, it'll stick to that magnet and it won't work its way through the rumen and get into the heart of the animal or anything like that. But that uh, reticulum just kind of hangs down there, and it's just a place for those large particles to fall. Then you've got the rumen, and in that rumen, there's a top floating mat, and that's your large particles that just, got pulled in during the grazing or browsing process consumed. And then the smaller particles kind of float around down. And this is the big vat where all of that microbial fermentation happens. So in order then to pass from the rumen to the abomasum, then those particles have to be um, condensed down to a 1 millimeter size. So those bacteria help with that, but that's also where we get that, when our ruminant species bed down, they pull up a bolus of food, they chew it on one side and goes back down and comes back up again, which the next time you go to the zoo, I encourage you to watch the giraffes do this, going all the way up that neck. It's just crazy. Why in the world were those made to be ruminants with that long neck? It's nuts to me. But anyways, so then that through the rumination process that breaks down those particle sizes, and they're very small. So then you go into the abomasum, which is also sometimes called many plies or many folds. Looking on the outside of it, it's round like a basketball, and it just has a lot of folds, and all the um, rumen fluid and everything passes through there. That's where in the rumen, a lot of volatile fatty acids or the byproducts from that fermentation are absorbed, but they're also really absorbed in that abomasum along with water. So that's where the water kind of gets taken out and recycled back. And then you go into the that was the omasum, and then the abomasum is the next step, and that is like our stomach. That's where the stomach acid is to break down your fats and your proteins and all of that, and then everything passes through down into the your hind gut, your small intestine, large intestine, and everything's similar to a monogastric animal from there. So that's kind of the overview of how ruminant digestion works.
Very interesting. So let me ask you this. You hit on the water and where it's absorbing and breaking down, and then you kind of use the term, I think, recycle back through the system. So for cattle, I've always been told deer get like 80% of their water from vegetation. Is that similar for cattle?
It's possible. So all ruminant species have varying needs for water, and it's going to depend on the season and what they're eating. If they're eating something that's really lush and full of water, they really don't need a lot to drink. If the temperature outside is pretty mild, but once that temperature starts rising, they need water to drink to fight um, heat stress, just like any other mammal. And then as they're seasonally browse and the forages dry out as well for the deer. So the drier their food is, then the more they're going to need another source of water. So for either of those, that's going to make a difference. But if they're consuming things that are very lush and full of water and temperatures aren't too hot or too cold, then they don't have a huge need for water per day.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So you mentioned about proteins breaking down kind of in the later part. So can you kind of give us a high level, like how is protein in a plant formed? And then how does that impact the digestion? So you and I, just for people listening, kind of went back and forth because there's a lot of information out there, and there's kind of this general idea of taking total nitrogen times 6.25, is it?
Yep.
Okay, times 6 point, and that gives you kind of total protein in a plant. But then you kind of help me through some of the nuances of that, and I'd like you to kind of speak to that, like what is a protein, right? For those
Uh-huh.
listening, and then um, can we talk about, are there varying qualities of protein when we're looking at a plant, and then how that it's going to be impacted by, or how that might impact a ruminant animal?
Yeah, for sure. So, yep, first starting, what is a protein? So, protein takes nitrogen and forms an amino acid. Then those amino acids kind of fold in upon themselves, and that's what gets you your protein. Um, but yes, for crude protein, I always say, like, think of it is crude. It's a crude measurement of the total protein. So it is nitrogen times 6.25. But when we're looking at plants, and I'm going to preface this, like, I am not an agronomist, I'm not a plant person at all. I know the basic understanding so that I can talk to livestock producers about these animal health risks I'm going to talk about. So the, my understanding for a plant, when it's stressed, if it has over fertilization, and so it's taken up too much nitrogen, or it doesn't have enough water to utilize that nitrogen. It's going to use the nitrogen and it's not going to form proteins. Instead, it's going to be like nitrates or prussic acid in the case of like sorghum Sudans. So where your mainly frame is for deer, we're not going to worry about the prussic acid because they're not going to be out there consuming a lot of leaves for the sorghum Sudan. Although with the new shoots, that it is possible, but where they don't sit and just eat the same thing, the risk is very low. Nitrates is something that could be possible if they didn't have a varied, choice in what they wanted to eat. But nitrate poisoning is specifically an issue for ruminants because what happens is that nitrate is not folded in with those amino acids. So it hits the rumen, those rumen microbes, they have direct access to it. They turn it into nitrite. And then that, gets burped up in those boluses and the animal starts breathing that in. And then that nitrite is actually what binds where your oxygen would bind on the heme of your blood cell, not yours, the animals, blood cells. And then that lack of oxygen, it can cause death in extreme cases. Usually what we're concerned about when we're talking about beef cattle is abortion. And that's where I'm not sure if this is really an issue for deer, but I would say, you don't want to spend a lot of extra money on inputs like nitrogen. And so it is important to make sure you're only putting out there what you need to grow your food plot or the forage that you're putting out there, whether it's for your domestic species or your wild species. So you don't want to have a lot of extra nitrogen, be it, in the environment, in the soils where it can wash out, or just in the plant where it can actually cause a problem for the animal that is going to consume it. If that kind of makes sense. Now another
Oh,
part of
absolutely.
protein. Oh, sorry.
I just was saying, absolutely. That's a great point. So please go ahead.
So another part of protein when we're talking about ruminant species is that what that crude protein we're feeding them is not actually the protein they're getting. And it's okay for a ruminant actually to have protein that's not in the form of amino acids, to have nitrogen that's not in the form of protein. Sorry, I misspoke. So, we have the two protein systems. So they're going to have metabolizable protein, which is this part that actually passes through all those four compartments of their stomach and hits that small intestine. And so that's going to be coming from the rumen microbes that are going to take the nitrogen that can come in as non-protein nitrogen, as well as the nitrogen that they've broken down from dietary protein and into microbial protein. And then you're going to have the dietary protein that bypasses and is unavailable to the rumen fermentation process. And so those two components are going to make up what protein the animal actually is going to get in their small intestine. So then with that, there are amino acid requirements for all animals. Lysine is typically the number one limiting amino acid. So I wouldn't know for sure if that's true for deer specifically, but it is important that they have some, amino acids, and lysine being one of them. And that's where in the ruminant nutrition world for like dairies, I've seen more so somewhat in the beef, you will see rumen protected amino acids to specifically make sure that they get through to that small intestine in a high enough number. But
So is that the goal with the rumen, is to get it to the small intestine and that's where it can be most absorbed to benefit the animal?
so partially, so when we're talking about protein, that yes, that's where it's going to be absorbed. When we're talking
Okay.
about other components of the diet, like the fiber, it's going to be broken down and turned into volatile fatty acids that are going to be absorbed. And those provide the animal energy. Those are going to be absorbed in the rumen as well as in the abomasum. And then your sugars that are left over from that fermentation and breakdown, those are going to pass through the small intestine and be absorbed as well. So, but
Okay. As
any
well as, and
sugars, oh, go ahead. Yes, sorry.
is the small intestine, I don't know if you can quantify it this way or not, but is there like a certain percentage of efficiency, like of what gets to the small intestine of what's then absorbed, like of protein? Is it, 80% of the protein that is there will get absorbed, or is it like, do we know like what gets absorbed versus what passes through?
Yeah, so that is a really good question. And so that's part of the feed efficiency question and research that we do, right? Is we do look at animals that are more feed efficient and require less feed for animal outcomes. So anytime we're talking about forage quality, we're really talking about animal outcomes based on their diet eating those. And then also, there's studies in uh all the domestic ruminant species where they look at, you know, the dietary protein in and protein out. Um, and then in ruminant species, we also have uh, nitrogen cycling that happens. So that's very interesting as well. So they can go below their dietary requirement for a little bit and just, recycle what they have. When we're talking about protein, nitrogen, is usually excreted through the kidneys. So somewhere along that process, then it can be recycled and reused by the animal. I don't know really the answer on how much is absorbed in the small intestine as far as a percent. Sorry. So that
No,
was a
it's
good way
okay.
for me to skirt around that question.
No, but and maybe it's varying depending on, but like where my mind goes, because there's so much out there that we're from a wildlife perspective, it seems like there's a lot of focus on how does stress impact wildlife. So you talked about nitrate in cattle impacting abortion, or what I would call in deer fawn mortality, right?
Yeah.
And or fawn recruitment if we're hoping to bump the numbers up. And a lot of that can be related to stress. So it could be environmental stress, dietary, whatever it might be, predatory, right? Coyotes, things like that. Are those stressing that animal out? And or if there's not a good habitat to hide the fawn, just directly impacting fawn recruitment post birth, but not necessarily because of the health of the mother. Um, but so one of the things I was just wondering about is how maybe those could be related in that, if the animal's healthier and it's less stress, that they absorb more, right, of the stuff that's getting to that small intestine. But this is just so fascinating to learn more, because it's so over my head and what I typically am talking about. And I'm sorry if I throw a couple questions and you're like, oh, I wasn't prepared for that one, but it just kind of popped into my mind. So no, you answered it
Well, that's good.
fantastically.
That's a conversation. I don't know the percent that's absorbed. That would be something I'd have to go look in the textbook. That's not something I get asked often. So
No, no problem. And so we talked about, the proteins, and let me just, I have some notes here. So I apologize to the viewers here that I just want to make sure I ask these things efficiently. I want to gather my thoughts. Um, so I'm sure you're aware, being at Ward, and one of the things too you hit on, which you're talking about, don't put out more than you need, and controlling inputs and understanding inputs and stuff. It sounds like a good pitch for getting a Ward soil test. So I wanted to mention that earlier because it is really, I mean, we obviously sell them on our website, and I don't know how many I've looked through already. This it's not even spring yet. Helping our customers, but it is so critical to really understand, these blanket ideas of like, go out there and throw 200 pounds of urea down. Like, wait, what? Like, you can't just blindly do that. There's so many things. So if you haven't done a soil test, go to Ward, go to Vitalize Seed and get a Ward soil test and test your soil. So in that, regenerative ag, which I find fascinating. I think it's really cool. I know it goes against the grain with some conventional things, but I do think there's a good bridging. Like anything in the world, we can find a good in between on things. And there seems to be, whether you're talking about a tomato or cover crops, or there seems to be this idea of this nutrient density. And it seems to sway from kind of this conventional thing, at least from a wildlife perspective, of just protein being the single source, right? That's always been pushed. Like if you go and look at a sporting goods store and you want to buy a bag of corn, to sell more corn, there's a protein infused, or higher protein or something like that. That's really what's been the focus. Well, now it's kind of like we're looking, in a total nutrient value in things. And that seems to be more of a, you hear of things like bricks testing and sap analysis and stuff like that from the plant's perspective. So my question is, what do you see on the animal nutrition side? Do you see any of those results? Are you interested in it? Do you see any validity to how that's impacting the animal?
So, what I would tell you is I do see customers who are, you know, running samples, and usually it's just a handful of samples. And like you said, corn grain, and they'll be wanting to run the minerals and the protein and see which one's higher. I haven't seen anything that really wowed me like, oh, wow, what a big difference. Because you have to remember there's two things, there's statistical significance. I haven't seen these things be looked at on a level that would, and this is just what I've observed. This is not doing a full scale look at all the research that's ever been done. These are the samples I've reviewed. I haven't seen anything that's blown me away. Wow, that's for sure going to have a statistical significance. And then, even if it did, is there a biological significance? I haven't seen. But what I can tell you is I've reviewed a lot of forage reports. I'm a big proponent of test your forages for mineral, because for the livestock side of things, you want to know what's in that before you start putting mineral out, and making sure that you have a good match and a complement so that you don't have issues. Um, as far as like a potentially like a toxicity, especially when we're feeding, like I know down the line you want to mention brass, because we've talked about that a little bit. If in the livestock industry they might be feeding cover crops, that could be an issue. You don't want to put a lot of a mineral that has a lot of sulfur out with that. Magnesium is another one that can become an issue if you're just feeding a high mag mineral because that's what you've always done, and it's actually can cause a toxicity as well. Um, so I'm very much in favor of testing that. And what I would say from a forage perspective, we've compiled our forages, and you can find it in the 2019 beef cattle report. And we do report that protein and those macro minerals, they do have a correlation to them. So the higher protein forage you have, the higher the mineral content is going to be. So that when you are looking at that, that is, something to consider. But the micronutrients, what we found is you can pretty much plan on supplementing copper and zinc. You really can't get enough of them. And I know you were talking about how wildlife handles stress. I don't know that there's really, I kind of dug into it. I kind of tried to look at like requirements for nutrient requirements specifically for deer, because that's what we were talking about. They don't go into the micronutrient requirements, which makes sense because they're a wild species. It's very difficult to find that. For cattle, zinc is really important for helping them handle stress. So making sure they have that, but it's really hard to cultivate a high zinc forage or even a high copper forage. And then you also have to be careful because some domestic ruminants are very sensitive to that because like copper accumulates in the liver. So you do need to be a little bit cautious when you think about just increasing everything. More isn't always better, but sometimes it definitely is. And we definitely have seen, I'd be very curious on some of those bags. If they're claiming higher protein because they grew a higher protein corn, that's great. If they're infused from like sometimes we ammoniate our straw, or if there's some kind of non-protein nitrogen and they're claiming that's protein, and we'll see that a lot with like lick tubs, like, oh, a protein supplement, non-protein nitrogen. Yes, that is considered a protein supplement in livestock and animal health world, but it's not true protein, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, I mean, it seems to me like based on all of the things that you mentioned there, that from a wildlife perspective, it would be highly beneficial to just have a good amount of diversity, not only in your fields or food plots, right? Because you don't want to just have a monoculture of, say, brassicas for some of the things that we might hit on later. But you also probably don't want just legumes, right? And having that diversity and in on your farm or on your property that the wildlife could so they can go in as a ruminant and they can eat on maple buds or they can eat in a CRP field, having some of those natural forms as well, to kind of let them figure out as a concentrate selector how they need to balance their ruminant. Would you think that's a fair assessment?
Yes, and I'm glad you talked about the natural stuff too. Like I said, kind of getting ready to have this discussion, I started trying to read about food plots and um, you're trying to attract them to your property for many reasons. And in doing so, you don't want to just clear out everything that's natural. Like I said, those browsers, they need those tannins just as much as they need fiber for healthy, like ruminant health. So throwing out a bucket of corn, you can cause acidosis. Removing those, maple buds and the natural things that they would browse on, you're taking out those tannins that, their saliva binds some, but it also keeps others. And the saliva for the ruminant, it provides a buffer and it helps maintain that pH. So that's why we need fiber. But the tannin part is also very interesting. And then in the livestock world, we're starting to look at that where we used to think tannins, they cause digestive upset. They're, animal health, we don't want to deal with them. Now we're seeing, well, actually, at a low limited level, that can help us reduce our odds of having bloat with, like alfalfa and clover. And so with when you're thinking of deer plots, you need to make sure that they still have access to some of what they're naturally going to be eating. And then, all ruminants are kind of, they're going to learn their browsing and their grazing behavior from their mothers, right? So we have on the livestock side, this was a hot topic a few years ago, and it seemed, I haven't read anything about it in a while, but they used to go and, put molasses on certain weeds so that the mothers would teach the calves how to eat the weeds. So when you've got your food plots, um, browsers are samplers. So they're going to sample things and they're going to be like, okay, I remember I like that. And then they're going to come back. But they're not going to just be inherently knowing, oh, I liked that, I'm going to eat that right away. So when you talk about the fawns out there with their mothers, they're learning what to eat. And so if there were ever a time when you didn't have that food plot, they need to be able to know what else they can also still eat. So there's a lot of different reasons to keep some of what they naturally are going to eat and not think of putting in a food plot as fully providing their whole entire diet. If that does
That's
that kind of make sense?
fantastic. And so I think for a lot of the people on the vitalized side, we preach so heavily, like, and I love food plots, right? I love to garden, I love food plots, but like I do a lot of my work with a chainsaw. And I tell people that's removing invasive species and or creating better habitat based on a state of Ohio forester's recommendation for wildlife. So that might be cutting a maple down to give stump sprouts for deer, let's say, and releasing a white oak or a red oak that was getting crowded, right? So there are certain things that you can do from a silviculture perspective that's both beneficial to your timber stand, but also to those wild ruminants. I'm curious though, because deer, and it's so common, like the big thing people preach is diversity, right? Don't just have your food plot. Don't just think you're gonna, feed your way to a big, healthy, mature deer or a healthy population of deer. You have to have diversity in all things. And even within our food plots, like we have 16 species of different things. Like we don't even want monocultures within those certain subsets of our areas. Do you find that that is more difficult in the cattle industry, in the domesticated market, to try to get people to have like a more diverse, like, hey, let the cows eat things other than fescue and a lick tub? I mean, is that a little? I'm just curious. Is that a little bit harder bridge to go over?
Well, so I would say in my role, I serve all producers. Like I said, I come from my master's degree was working on the feedlot side of things. So I don't try to get producers to do anything. I support them in what they are doing. What
Okay.
I've seen a lot of interest in producers doing, and remembering we're in Nebraska, so most of the producers I work with are Nebraska, South Dakota, Wyoming. So the biggest thing I see producers working with as far as diversity is just getting them to graze cover crops, and then also using more of our crop land as grazing land. So I'm working with a lot of producers, helping them navigate those territories more so than pushing them into doing or trying to get them to change how they do things. In Wyoming, it's a lot of range and a lot of hay, and that's a lot of that is because of weather and just kind of the environment restrictions. I would say the same for South Dakota. There are probably more grasslands. I'd say I see a lot of native prairie and a lot of native prairie hay. And that CRP hay, like I've talked about, that I've done some work with too. So when you are looking at the native grasslands, it's not necessarily that you need to be out planting a variety of seeds, but you just need to be grazing it and maintaining it in such a way that it allows multiple species to thrive. So some of the work I did with the CRP stuff, I found, it's low quality by the time we actually get to harvest it. And it's a lot of your tall grasses, right? And they kind of have maybe choked out some of your shorter, forbs and legumes. And then along with that, there's a lot of research out there that shows for birds, um, the way that we're managing our CRP ground by just not haying it and not letting cattle graze it is actually maybe not the best for having a diverse population of birds. And I am thinking it could extend beyond that to other wildlife, but you're restricting you're basically getting tall grasses instead of a more diverse plant species, and then it goes into the birds. So that's kind of more of where I've come from. I don't I work with some, who do cover crops, but I don't necessarily make recommendations as to this is what you should plant because of this diet or whatnot. Um, if I hope that kind of helps.
It does. And again, it's like everything you say, there's such a parallel example in my mind because we deal with the same thing. I told you before we started recording, I'm in southeastern Ohio on our farm and we manage it primarily for timber. And what has happened is there was this idea of like an unmanaged forest is a good forest, right? And that was like this idea where you just let everything go. But what we found is that we were actually outcompeting our native oaks because they're such slow growers. And fire has been removed off the landscape, obviously, because of urbanization and people moving and stuff. You don't have these huge fires going through the landscape. So what has happened is like our forests that were primarily oak hickory are now beech maple with some oak struggling. So if you don't go in there and manage those things, very similar to CRP, you end up with not quite a monoculture, but you don't have the diversity that you should have. And in some cases, not necessarily in my area, but in some cases, even oak savanna landscapes where you have, an oak every 150 yards, and then between it was native grasslands, right? Which is just an amazing thing to envision. And certainly I can relate to a lot of things you said there with kind of just letting the CRP go, right? If we leave it, well, that's not always the case. There should be some type of management occurring. It sure seems. Um, Let me catch my thoughts again. I apologize. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because I think we've hit on a lot of these things. But um, I've done a lot of sampling. I've talked to you about this before. I've done a ton of soil samples. I'm super specific on how I do soil samples. So I'll just highlight it for anybody that might be interested. And I've run this by people at Ward, as well as some other really trusted agronomists that I have become friends with. I use GPS on my phone and I take like an acre grid. I take within that acre, I'm using the same GPS coordinates every time. I'm taking same time of year, same depth, 6 inches on a soil probe. And I'm going to those specific areas every year or every other year, depending. The only time I step outside of that is if there's some type of anomaly. An area is doing superb, or obviously the other end of that spectrum. I've also done quite a bit of tissue testing for mostly for cover crop analysis. I wanted to get an understanding of we strive a lot on at Vitalized Seed of having a 1-2 system. We're really focused on carbon and nitrogen ratios and how are the microbes going to break from one planting to the next, and how are they going to break those down and cycle that nutrients to reduce my need for inputs, right? And I wanted to do tissue sampling to get an understanding of like, well, what is my above ground only biomass? I can assume organic matter mineralization, and I can get ballparks and the rest of that. But what is that above ground biomass? And I've had really consistent results. But from somebody who has a scientific background and is an expert like yourself in your field, what do you look for? Like how to set a baseline for somebody who's trying to monitor their progress on their property or their farm or their feedlot? Like just from a sampling perspective in general, does it pay to do those smaller scale samples? I mean, and track it on your own ground? Like what would you like? What would you look for or say is kind of a baseline to seeing? And I'll just share, you and I had looked at a couple different things that have been shared on various mediums, and they take like 1 or 2 samples and they kind of will make a claim of something that seems maybe a little bit outlandish, or in some cases maybe under explained. So kind of from your scientific perspective, what do you look for when you're looking for like, that's good sample and here's the results I feel comfortable getting from that example?
Yeah. Okay. So really good question. Really hard question when we're talking about cover crops, and especially talking about a ruminant diet. So the 2 by 2 foot sampling that you're talking about, you're looking at biomass, you're just looking at nutrients. I think that that is a great tool. I would say, you know, how are you are you randomly picking your spots that you're taking them from? Perfect. Yep. So it sounds like what you're doing is great for that, for what your sampling purposes are. I'm on the nutrition side, so my purposes that I usually look at the samples for are nutritional values, and so mainly looking at cattle. You want to go out and you want to imitate how they're going to graze and then take your sample accordingly. And when it comes to cover crops, you're going to end up with a gigantic trash bag full of stuff. I say if it's a big flat field that's got cover crops, walk a diagonal of that whole entire field and take samples as you go. Um, and then once you're done, you've got your giant trash bag. You're going to have to dump it all out, cut it into a bunch of little pieces, and then we recommend the cone and quarter method where you pile it all up in a cone, you divide it into 4 quarters. And I mean, you're probably going to have to do this in on a tarp in your garage if you're truly getting a good representative sample. um and you take 2 quarters and leave 2 quarters, and then remix it up and do it all over again until you get it down to a gallon or a quart size Ziploc bag. um so that's a lot of work to get a good representative sample for a beef cow diet. Now, when we're talking about deer, I honestly don't think that it's possible to get a good representation of what they're getting because we're totally just guessing. We can look at what they're consuming, but we don't know what happens when they leave the food plot. Where are they going? What are they getting? But if you're just trying to compare 2 different plots, then and how a treatment maybe had affected that. The thing is, you can't just look at 1 or 2 values. You need to look at that forage as a whole. So, for your example, let's say you had 2 food plots and you did the 2 by 2 sampling, and you're submitting it to the lab like that, and you're not necessarily looking at it from a nutritional, but just how did this forage perform.
Yeah.
I think, we can run that analysis, but we need to look at protein. We need to look at the fibers. If possible, if it's a non-brassica mix, we can run NIR at Ward Labs and we can look at the digestibility of that fiber because that makes a difference. And then you also want to look at your starches, your sugars, um, non-fiber carbohydrates, fat, ash. If you want to get into the weeds, you can do minerals, but I always like to look at those as a pie chart. And so as one slice of the pie gets bigger, other slices are going to get smaller. And depending on what the nutrient or component, I should say, is, because fibers, fats, sugars, those aren't really nutrients. They're providing energy. We don't really have a requirement for them necessarily. Fat, you somewhat do, but when we're talking about ruminants, they're going to get their fat from breaking down of carbohydrates. And so if you're just looking at the small carbohydrates provided by the forage, you're only looking at what the microbes are getting instantly. You're not looking at what the animal is going to get from those microbes fermenting, breaking that down, and that's where the characteristics of that are going to come into play, like the digestibility and how much of that fiber is actually lignin and things like that. So that pie chart is where you look at everything as a percent. And so you may have more protein in one forage than the other. And you may have, a 1% difference in starch. But if the fibers, if that's all accounted for in the fibers, that's not going to make a difference when it comes to animal performance or like if we're talking about our deer, how they're going to lay down that fat. When they choose those little plant pieces, it's not going to have an effect on their performance. It's going to be the same. So kind of having an understanding of looking at it as the whole, as opposed to when we're comparing two plots or, a treated and an untreated of any type, you can on your own operation run those small experiments, but just be really careful not to put too much stock in one value. And then if you're like a big company like Vitalized Seed and you're going to claim like this seed mix is the best, it does the best, you had better have plots from, all different regions and different environments and have a control and a treated or, whatever, however you're doing it, and have some statistical significance to that, which I'm not a statistician either. But you have to have some statistical power to make those claims. And then you have to look at the science to see if the statistical significance translates to biological significance, because sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes something statistically significant doesn't mean anything.
So it's fascinating. And I'm so happy you used that example because that's something where I try to, sometimes people will say, you guys do a lot in the food plot world. Why don't you put a big buck on the bag, and I always say, well, because I like love planting food plots and doing all of the things, but 1 acre food plot is not going to impact a deer from the point of now you can guarantee big antlers. And I just not knocking that's some way people look at marketing, but I've been much more focused on like, let's make the soil or the medium in which we're growing these things healthy and let the deer pick what they like. Right. But let me ask you, so you mentioned lignin and there has been a debate for years. So a lot of wildlife guys will grow clover. And there was a gentleman, I believe it was Dr. Craig Harper out of University, Knoxville, Tennessee. And he did this big test and basically came out with, you don't need to mow your clover plots because all you're doing is reducing tonnage. And the counter argument to that was, yes, but as clover gets more mature, it gets more filled with lignin. Dr. Craig Harper, and I hope I'm not misquoting his study because it's been a couple of years. His point was, but a deer is not going to eat the part of the plant that's filled with lignin anyways. So what you're doing is you're removing, because I started to back up, but I just want to make sure that it's clear. The argument is, well, when you clip the clover, you keep it in this vegetative state and it becomes more palatable because now it has to grow more. And if you let it go, it continues to grow, but it gets so full of lignin that it's not as digestible. And his counter argument is a very bright, who's done some amazing wildlife research, Dr. Craig Harper was like, it doesn't matter because the part that's getting full of lignin isn't the part that the whitetail deer, I don't know if other deer would be the same, but at least for whitetail, they're not eating that. So maybe for a grazer, like a cow, it would maybe impact them. Yeah. But from a concentrate selector's perspective, or a browser, to use the terminology you started with, it wouldn't impact them. What's your thoughts on that as the animal scientist?
Oh yeah, I would agree. I would totally agree. But I would say, that's where you have to be careful and make sure they have access to their natural feedstuffs that has tannins in it. Because you can have bloat issues. And I actually worked with a producer in Idaho who had some fields, and he was very progressive minded. So he didn't want to do any management in these fields. He wanted them to be, natural and diverse and everything. And they started just getting taken over with clover. And he had goats, which, if you recall what we talked about earlier, they are the only true browsing species, but they didn't have access to anything that had tannins in them, right? They didn't have access to tree lines and stuff because they're fenced into this
Mhm.
his acreage, and he had problems with bloat. So that's where, yeah, absolutely, those deer are going to come along. They're going to eat the good parts of that clover just like that guy's goats did, but then they're also going to go back in the trees and eat their wild shrubbery, and they're going to be just fine. The goats were not. But
Yeah.
so you might want to consider management if it starts to become a problem as far as overtaking a field and being, too much, but actually cutting it and keeping it in that growth stage might actually be encouraging it to do the opposite. So he did have to go in with the herbicide to get rid of it. And then be more careful and make sure and plant um, varieties that compete well with that, so that it wouldn't just take over his field. So, but
Yes, it's fascinating. So let me ask you this then. If I was to take a monoculture of a clover field and I took that 2 by 2 sample, I just want to circle back to one of the things we talked about earlier. And I said, okay, I want to know roughly, this is a 1 acre square, it's a monoculture of clover, and I'm sending you the tissue test. I took a 2 by 2 square and said, okay, I'm going to send this all to you. I want to know how much value this has for whitetail deer. If I understand you correctly, you would say, well, we can't, because you gave me the stems and everything. And really, the only part that would be digestible would be these leaves. And even if they might eat a stem, let's say it comes up on the top and they pick it off, you're saying that that's probably not digestible fiber anyways, or it could have a low amount, or like, is there value in that
if
kind of generalized, or alfalfa would be another good example. A lot of people might grow that and they go, deer just love it. They like, or soybeans, another one.
yeah,
Well, they do, but they don't typically eat the stem unless it's super,
right.
super young, right? So, what are your thoughts on that kind of analysis?
Yeah, so that I recommend our NIR analysis for that would be perfect. But I would say sample it in a way that's how the deer are consuming it to see what they're actually getting out of it. So if they are consuming, like parts of the stem, it's not that, oh, that stem just passes through, right? They still ruminate on it, it ferments. It's just that those lignin pieces make it less digestible, and deer need that. Deer need lignin. They need fiber in their rumen. That's what stimulates rumination. If everything was just this highly palatable protein and sugar going in, then the rumen microbes just have a party, and bloat is what the result is. So you need that lignin in some stemmy portions, and the deer, they are going to eat some of that. But when it comes to trying to estimate their diet, it's really difficult. But if you're just trying to say, okay, out of this feed stuff, then just make sure you go across your field. I wouldn't recommend the 2 by 2 square. I'd recommend samples from all over the field, and representing as best you can exactly what you think they're going to be getting. And that's really difficult to do. We can't do it for a ruminant or for cattle, and they're a lot easier to estimate what they're going to do, and we've spent a lot more time watching them graze. Um, but we can get close and we can get a good idea. And then, yeah, if you were trying to compare, again, that's where I'd say, dude, let's run a near infrared analysis so that we can get our protein, our fibers, the digestibility of that fiber, the lignin, starch, water soluble carbs, all of that information. And again, look at it like it's a pie chart and see, you could compare two different plots. Um, and see how that would look. But
Well, that's fascinating
yeah.
because I've seen a lot of things over the years of like, I planted this XYZ clover, and it's look at this protein analysis, and that's why you should plant it for your deer or alfalfa or soybeans or whatever. And it's really interesting that you, as an expert in this, are saying, it's hard to do this for cattle and to try to share that for deer would be really difficult. And I would imagine, and I'm kind of going into one of my other questions, but I mean, in your experience when you're looking at cover, I would imagine it really is variable depending on this quality of the soil and previous practices and all of those other things that are impacting the growth of that next forage. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'd say that definitely happens. And so, like one example is recently I went to it was an extension day, and it was put on with Arrow Seed did some trials on their sorghum stands and millets, and they had one sample of soybeans. I don't know. That one seemed very misplaced, but or whatever. They had multiple plots across like I want to say like 6 different producers fields, and it was really interesting because they didn't find a lot of differences in based on the varieties of the seeds in the nutritional values, whether we were looking at protein or energy for beef cattle or the the fibers themselves. But when they looked at the mineral content, um, they did see samples that were planted on fields that had alfalfa grown before. The prior crop was alfalfa, which we know alfalfa takes up a lot of potassium. So that those samples were lacking in potassium. So, some of those detailed things is where you kind of get into the micronutrients of it, where yes, protein's correlated, but there are other factors that impact it. So you have to be careful making kind of those kind of assumptions that it's going to be. So.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, just out of curiosity, because was that alfalfa harvested or grazed off previously?
Harvested and then terminated, and then they put the plants
So you
into it.
lost a lot of the legumes or excuse me, the nitrogen that legume had probably fixed in the harvesting. I mean, I'm sure there was some residual, but not like you got a cover crop credit for that end fixation because it was harvested and then taken off. So did you see higher nitrogen in those or protein, excuse me, in those plants where the alfalfa had been grown?
No, there were not differences, but this was just the first year of the trial, so we'll see what happens as they go. Yeah, I don't
It'd be
know.
interesting to see if maybe if it, like if you didn't remove the alfalfa, like if you used alfalfa, which isn't typically a crop you would use
Yeah,
as
if
a
you
cover
just
crop,
planted into it, yeah.
but if you just planted into it, or maybe if it was like a hairy vetch or something, like maybe more of a cover crop species, not as high dollar of a species, how would that impact just anyways, as a total sidebar, I apologize, but it just was something that popped into my mind. Um,
Yeah, I don't
so
know, but you could reach out to the researchers if they
yeah,
maybe
it's
would know more than I do.
super interesting. But I think it's interesting. I mean, to your point, it's still very valid, right? Because the alfalfa had been grown there, it had been harvested, and it removed a lot of the potassium, which then impacted that next growth. So could we make a generalized assumption that if it had not been, maybe it would have had a positive impact on the next crop? I would like to think, and we talk about that a lot in the wildlife industry. Is like we really want to a lot of our soils that we're working on. I mean, they're not the pristine agricultural soils, right? I mean, so they're old logging decks, and we're trying to reclaim these areas that had been highly degraded. And one of the things that I tell people a lot is it's very difficult to do that without a lot of inputs if everything that you grow is walking off the field. Because I put up, we call them exclusion fences. So it just measures the browse line on the field. And if I have a 3 acre field and I have this much, 2 foot difference between what was planted and what's off the field, that tells me that those deer are having at least somewhat, right? And then we also look at camera surveys. We look at native browse surveys. So those maples and things like that. We do a whole big thing and collect all this data to understand what level of stress is or is not occurring because of the density of animals on the landscape to both the native habitat, right? Or is it the native habitat getting stressed, and are the wildlife getting stressed, right? And there's all these things we talked about a little bit earlier. So I'm like curious on your take on, I don't know if I apologize if I use the wrong terminology, but like stocking rates and things like that. Like if a few are good, more is better, right? Well, I'm assuming that's not the case. How do you go about measuring that when they're grazing on cover crops and things like that? And if you could just kind of walk through that as to how important is understanding the density relative to the available food for the cattle that you're supporting.
So for cattle, I actually don't work a lot with the stocking rates and stuff. I kind of leave that to the producers, and
Okay.
UNL has a lot of good tools to figure that out. When they're doing cover crops, um, usually they are what the goal is to get some of that trampled in. So usually they're doing very high. Oops, sorry, my lights.
Oh, energy
Hold on.
savers.
Okay, there we go. I was being too still. No, usually with the cover crops, usually they're trying to get some of that mashed into the soil, and so they are usually doing like more of a mob grazing. So they've got them really condensed in there, and they're moving the fence at least once a day. Some producers are really going after it twice a day if they're full time producers and they don't have a job outside of, you know, cattle, but because that's a lot of labor. Um, so a lot of them, that's kind of what they're doing. And then some of them that I've seen, they are moving it a few days, once every 2 or 3 days. Um, and on those ones, I've seen what's really interesting. I got invited to go out on a producer's field one time, and um, you had some cattle reaching out over that fence line trying to get whatever they could get before he moved it, because they were like, "Ah, yeah, let me after it." And then you had others that were back there pulling up the brassicas and enjoying that. So that's something, there's individual differences as well. But obviously managing cover crops that then they're going to go plant corn into in Nebraska is very different. You're not worried about leaving half, take half, leave half, like we are on grasslands and things like that. And that's the grassland management is really where the stocking rate comes in with uh, the deer, or I mean the cattle. But sorry, I was thinking about what you said about the camera surveys with the deer. Um, so browsers, if they're stressed nutritionally, they're going to start to act like grazers and just try to eat whatever they can. So that'd be very interesting to see if you, on your camera surveys, if you start to see, are there picture cameras or like video cameras?
You can have both. So I don't have ones that are as much video. Um, but to I think where you're going. So what I rely on is the expert in a primarily woodland setting in whitetails, right? Which is the state forester that I'm very, very close relationship with. And what she has a whole list of just off the top of her head, and I've started to learn them over the last 15 to 20 years of doing this, is what plants should deer be eating? What plants do they eat sometimes? And what plants are they only eating if they're starving?
Yeah.
So, like an example of that is like a beech um, brush. Like if you were to fell a beech tree and it stump sprouts, primarily foresters actually say to use an herbicide because deer do not eat it. Well, if you go through an area and you realize every single one of these looks like goats was on it, right? They're just hammering it so hard. That's an indication of a stressed animal. So to your point, they're acting almost like a grazer.
Yeah.
Um, there's other signs too, like when clovers, if you have a clover monoculture, at times, this isn't always necessary, but it can go dormant, say in the wintertime in Ohio, you an inch or two of snow, and the deer are digging up to eat a dormant plant versus like an actively growing plant. Like that takes a lot of energy to dig through the snow and stuff and eat that. Now that's not always the case. Sometimes they're just doing that because they have a huge, highly diverse diet. But there's some triggers like that. But then I always am very focused on people measuring, although we can't quantify. I think we've made that point pretty good during this time. There's so much variability to a wild animal that it's hard to quantify everything. But what we can quantify is by simply putting up a 3 foot, chicken wire fence or 14 gauge wire fence on an acre or 2 acres or 3 acres or whatnot. Like in my situation, I plant, 40 to 50 acres a year. So if I'm looking at every field and seeing that there's 2 foot gone from the summer, cover crop on 40 acres on every field, and then I notice that same in the winter. Well, that's a pretty good indication, even if the native habitat is really good. That's a lot of food getting removed.
Mhm.
So again, we go through those other checklists. That doesn't mean necessarily anything, but you certainly can start to quantify an
Mhm.
idea as to what's happening here. Um, so I have a few more questions, and I probably could talk to you for like 5 days because I find all of this so fascinating. And I wanted to talk about, and I apologize again. I just want to make sure I get my thoughts here straight. We kind of hit on this already. I think I'm going to skip over or at least just touch on it. So there are always things, and it's I would imagine the same in agriculture. I have quite a few friends who are farmers, and it's always, there's always polarizing topics within any industry. And normally somebody has their heels tucked in somewhere where there's a benefit to them as to why they're on one side or another. Maybe that's a bad generalization, but in my experience, that tends to be it. And some of the things that get thrown around a lot are, you know, um, brassica toxicity. Oh, don't feed corn because of, you mentioned acidosis. Alfalfa, you're going to have bloat in your deer. Don't let your deer eat alfalfa. Like there's always something. And to me, persimmons is another one. Like if I had to cut down every persimmon tree in Ohio, I mean, or at least on my farm, like I wouldn't be able to do this. That's for sure. I'd just be running a chainsaw forever. Like we have a lot of persimmon trees, which create like almost like a little crab apple looking. It falls down. The deer eat them. They love them. It seems like a lot of this in a wild animals, how you described a rumen and how they eat is a very, very minimal risk. I mean, it seems to me like they're going to have high diversity naturally. I think it's estimated between 70 and 85% of their browse is things like ragweed, pokeberry. I've had beautiful food plots to watch a deer eat pokeberry off on the side that's coming up. Um, but again, from an expert, because I'm not, I want to ask you, what's your thought? You've done some research on deer and kind of the stuff that's out there. Do you feel that any of these, if somebody plants or puts out some corn for a deer or a protein feed, or they plant alfalfa, do you think that there really is any major risk, or do you think that most of it's going to be balanced by the deer's ability to be a concentrate selector or a browser?
So they are a concentrate selector and browser, but they still are, mammals, just like you or me. Or maybe we talked a little bit about our kids before this. Maybe they're more like our 2 and 3 year old, where if you put a pile of candy bars next to their nice, well balanced dinner with, broccoli and chicken and rice, they're going to eat all the candy bars. So I'd say the worst thing you could do is put out a pile of corn, because you are going to risk causing that animal at least temporary digestive upset. And you don't want to do that. I've looked into and I see there's a lot of pelleted feeds that have been formulated to be palatable and also provide a lot of fiber in that diet. I'd say that's not, a terrible thing to do. You're not going to hurt that animal, but that's where opinion comes in as to, you know, you're feeding it now, you're kind of turning it into almost domesticated like
Yeah.
um versus food plots. You're trying to attract them, so there is still some element of that, but you're trying to do it in a management way where you're providing diversity. With food plots, some of the stuff I've read too, and obviously knowing zoology and stuff, my background, deer need cover, and so I know with food plots you can put things in the mix that provide cover. So you're not training them to eat out of a feeder, which is, I don't know. And a lot of this part is really just my opinion, right? But
Yeah.
But ultimately, let's say you just are an alfalfa producer producing hay on alfalfa, you're going to naturally get a lot of deer over there eating your alfalfa. So, food plot is kind of the same thing, except for you're putting some thought into trying to get different. Like, you're very big on the diversity. You've made that very clear. And that's the thing I've read is the biggest thing is try and get different things that are coming available throughout different seasons for the deer. And you talked about that winter deer kind of poking and digging, and that's a thing too. They're not consuming as much in the winter because they're not the same as our domestic species whose intake requirement increases with cold weather. Deer have adapted, and they are supposed to eat seasonally, um which is strange to think about, but really interesting too. Um,
Absolutely.
so,
Absolutely. And so like when somebody comes out with something like I've seen about, different brassicas, again, I mean, and then they'll throw out words like I actually wrote them down, glucosolates and geogentric compounds, um,
oh,
sulfur toxicity. Do you find so everything that I found, it's like, well, a lot of it's honestly based in cattle, but I think it probably correlates to deer pretty well, and it's just don't do a monoculture, right? Like don't do if you're doing 10 acres of this for cattle to graze, don't just do purple top turnips, right? Because some might like crimson clover and some might like rye grain and some might, right? Like so my question there is do you think there's validity in there, whether it be for cattle or deer, in having that diversity to help to mitigate some of those risks of overeating something that may be good or not?
yeah. So, yes, I'm sorry. I did not answer your question the first
It's
time.
okay. No,
I
you did
thought you were
fine.
asking me something different. Yes, with the brassicas, I have personally helped producers who have had sulfur toxicity. The nitrate toxicity is probably a bit overblown in the brassicas. We actually did some um, we shared some of our nitrate data with Dr. Mary Janowski out of UNL, and her and her grad student at the time, I believe she's now at Iowa, um, Mary Beth Lentz, and she might have a different last name now too. They put together a survey and they found that the fresh forages and specifically the brassicas, they can have 5,000 parts per million nitrate nitrogen, which is where we say, okay, don't feed that. But people aren't seeing problems with that grazing cattle on it. And so that may be a little bit overblown, and that might be a place in domestic ruminant nutrition. We need to go back and revise our recommendations, whether the nitrate is in a fresh forage or a grazed forage and things like that. A dried down maybe might make a difference too, because we get dry plants, in the fall
Yeah.
moving forward. But the sulfur toxicity, I have worked with cattle producers on it. I obviously haven't, who calls the vet when there's a deer stumbling around acting weird in their field? Like, you don't,
Mhm.
so I don't know. But I would say as long as they had access to their own, what they would naturally be eating, as well as other things in the food plot, it should be okay to have brassicas in that mix. I probably wouldn't recommend just planting brassicas for brassica's sake, but there's, you know, lots of different reasons for that. I know people like them to kind of break up compaction, and that's a lot of the reason they're included in cover crop mixes where we plan to graze cattle on cropland, is to kind of ease that um, mind of that producer. But as long as you keep livestock specifically out of there before it gets too sloppy in the spring, the compaction risk has been shown to be very minimal and not affecting like corn yields or anything like that, which that's kind of veering off and not what we're trying to talk about or what you're asking me. But yeah.
No, but I think it's all very good points. Now, on the sulfur toxicity, was that because of just too much of a diet that was related to brassicas? Were they supplementing with a sulfur supplement as well? Um, because it's interesting to me because a lot of like row crop ground and even a lot of whether it be food plots or gardens now in the Midwest, a lot of people are now adding sulfur again to their soils because we're not getting the acid rain like we used to get. We're not burning as much coal. We have scrubbers and things. So there's a lot of data out there on the agronomy side of people saying, hey, if we want to get XYZ yields out of corn or beans, we actually need to add a little bit of sulfur. And there's it might be elemental, maybe it's in another form as well. So in the situation with the cattle, again, probably not as diverse of a diet as say a whitetail. But I'm just out of curiosity, was that a situation like what got it to that point?
So they were only consuming the brassicas at that point. That's the last thing the cattle will eat. So they kind of are going to eat in phases, right? So
Interesting.
kind of what's up high near their head, and then they go down. So then the brassicas are the last thing they pull out, and brassicas can accumulate sulfur to a point where it would be at the toxic level for cattle. But most producers, I haven't really ever heard of anybody. I guess there's a few that are, they don't need to have mineral. Most good producers are going to have mineral out. And so that is going to obviously push that issue over the edge if it's close. So for that situation, yes, they had mineral. They had to get those guys off of that. Unfortunately, the PEM you had mentioned there, yeah, that is very difficult. I don't think most cattle come back from that. So it's devastating
Wow.
when that does happen. But luckily, I mean, it doesn't happen a lot, so it's a risk, but it doesn't happen a lot. It's not something that is like, I'm answering phone calls every day about it. Nitrates, on the other hand, every day. So,
Wow, really? It's interesting to me because just from a deer's perspective, right? So there's always been this like a lot of guys just will plant a monoculture of brassicas. And a lot of guys won't. Like in our mixes, we have a whole lot of stuff, but we do have brassicas in there. Some are forage varieties that were actually developed for cattle. So they're not as much of the tuber variety, but they can actually handle browse and then regrow.
oh,
Um, so some of those like Winfred forage brassica doesn't create a big tuber. It's a much smaller root going down, but has a nice, beautiful top. It's actually a hybrid between like kale and I forget what else. But just as a side note, I found this really interesting. And you and I talked before the call about some of the microbial things happening in soils, but um, there have been a lot of our customers who've gone with our fall cover crop mix. And they said, man, I never have had deer eat brassicas when I've planted them in a monoculture. But when I planted them in this highly diverse mix, they will consume the brassicas. Now, it might be a density thing. Obviously, you're not planting the same rate because it's not. But I found that interesting. I mean, we sell from Maine to I'm trying to think the furthest west, like maybe Nebraska. I mean, I've sold some stuff pretty far west, and certainly Texas and all the way down to North Florida. And I might have one customer that they said they didn't eat the purple top turnips. That's it. I mean, and we sell a lot. So something happens within this highly diverse mix that this concentrate selector says, I like some of this and I want some of this. And they don't have this feeling of like, here's a monoculture of purple top turnips and I'm not going to eat that because something seems off, or I am going to eat it and get sick, right?
so brassicas are also typically very high in sugar content. So if they're out there sampling and what's in this, what's in that, and they sample it and they taste that, then it's going to bring them back to it for sure.
So a few more questions here, and then I will let you go. And also, I'm going to have to go because the kids are going to be going nuts here. I'm in Eastern time. So,
Oh
so,
yeah,
uh,
dinner
okay.
time.
So, yeah, very soon here. So, I had a question from a YouTube follower, Steve. He had asked, and I'm assuming there's a lot of research on this for cattle, but your take on is
Yep.
there anything we could provide to wild animals to reduce tick and fly stress that you're aware of?
Okay, so I don't know, honestly. The fly stress in Western Nebraska the past couple years has been crazy. It's been a real hot topic. a lot of producers are trying to go all natural, so they actually have lick tubs that contain garlic that's supposed to help control them.
Mm.
I've heard mixed results. I've also heard it works the first year, it doesn't work the second year. So it might be one of those things that yeah, mixed results, I don't know. And I am not a deer expert by any means, and I don't know what's even, you know, what can you even actually, like, are there rules about that if it's a medication, having that out? I don't know. So
Super fascinating. Super fascinating. And I think there's a lot of questions within the whitetails world with some of the different things. It's EHD is a disease that's they get from a midge fly that happens in a lot of times. I had always been told it was related to droughts, but then I think that science has been disproven now, and they're like it's more so related to when you have higher densities, maybe higher than what would naturally be occurring densities. It can create where one gets it, but then they're around each other, and then it gets to the next one, and so on and so forth. So I would like to learn more about that, but there certainly have been people who have tried to find ways, whether it's a mineral or some type of antibiotic that they could feed. I know some of that might be done in captive whitetails
oh
because there
yeah, I
is some
love
people
that.
who do some captive whitetail stuff, but I'm not as familiar with it. And there's also chronic wasting disease that is impacting deer, whitetail deer now in the eastern United States. Unfortunately, it's been out west for a long time. I think like since the 60s, but that's another big focus from a lot of really smart biologists who are trying to figure out how can we positively control this. And again, in a wild animal, gets a little bit trickier. Are you how do you give them a shot, right? Or how do you give them how do you inoculate an entire wild species, even if you could figure out how to stop that, right? So just something that I find to be
What's
interesting.
EHD stand for?
Oh, good
I
question.
don't know. I'm not familiar with that one.
Let me
Or I'm not remembering.
Epizootic hemorrhagic disease, EPIZOOTIC.
Yeah.
Um, and then it's a viral disease that affects primarily white-tailed deer, transmitted by biting midges, causes feeder hemorrhaging and often death, often within 8 to 36 hours of onset. It's really yeah,
Yeah, that's no
it's a
problem.
rough one. It's a very rough one. I've seen people who have found 40, 50 deer on, a square mile farm. It'll cut a population by 50 to two-thirds in some really bad cases.
And then the chronic wasting disease, if that's the one I'm thinking of, um, that's the prion disease, right?
Yes.
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 Yeah, it was discovered by Beth Williams, out at CSU for sure. Yeah, that one is, um, yeah, I don't know. I took prion biology. That is just terrible.
Yes. It's quite scary, and there's quite a lot of really brilliant whitetail biologists, as well as others, that are working very hard to figure it out. So,
Yeah,
well,
I
I
don't think
think
there is a shot or anything that yeah, it's just scary.
well, right, yeah, right now, I mean, that's I was just saying, like hypothetically, that's one of the big decisions. If they were able to find something that would work, then it's like, well, how would you administer it? And if you even could, because yeah, it's difficult right now. Honestly, the biggest thing that they're doing is cutting down densities heavily to try to reduce the spread in areas and where it is. So if
Yeah.
it, like let's say it's 50 to 60 deer per square mile, DNRs in and don't shoot the messenger right to anybody
Yeah.
listening that doesn't agree with this, because I'm just telling you what they've done. We have a couple counties in Ohio that has been found in wild populations. So they're testing, testing, testing. So if a deer is harvested, they have to, I think they cut the lymph nodes out, and then they can test it there. And then they're also doing extended hunting seasons and things of that. And they want to reduce those populations instead of 20 deer per square mile. I'm just throwing out numbers for talking. Maybe they want 5 to really cut down those things to reduce the spread and try to control it. So it's a really hot topic. It's one that I try to stay away from, honestly, just because I I don't like it. It's kind of doom and gloom. I hope not, but it's not a fun topic, and it's out in the wild now, unfortunately, in a lot of states, in our wild animals.
But yeah, fly control then would be a big thing if for that EHD, that would be the chronic wasting disease. I don't think we even know how they get it. So I don't know that there's anything that you can do. That's just
Yeah. Yeah, it's very difficult. So the last question I have for you is, what did I leave out? I know we talked about a lot. I always tell people I'm just the average Joe. So I appreciate when somebody with your background, your level of expertise allows me to, talk to them, interview them, pick their brain. And I haven't done a lot of these, so this is really cool. But I certainly have done it tons with all the great people at Ward over the years of emailing and phone calls and things. So with all of that said, did I leave anything out? Is there anything that you think people should know when they're considering planting forages or considering supplemental feeding or anything at all that you want to touch on that you felt like I left out?
I don't think you left anything out. But what I would say just in general, when we talk about starting anything new, when you're a land manager, whether you're a new land manager, an older land manager, and you're listening to other people and you're trying to absorb information about what to do, there's a lot out there. And I would say that you're a great example of someone who looks at it with a critical mindset and a critical lens. That's what I liked about, we started by emailing back and forth, and usually, I'll be honest, someone says, "Oh, I have been talking to Patrick and I'm really into regenerative agriculture." A lot of times they don't like what I have to say back. Specifically where I said, I think that some of the things we're looking at is outside of biological relevancy and things like that. Um, and so we don't have to agree on everything. And, some of the other experts you've mentioned, we might not always, everyone doesn't have to agree on everything, but what's going to work for you on your operation, you have to decide that. And I think that thinking the way Albert thinks, the way you think, is probably a really great way to go about it, and taking information from
Thank you.
different places and synthesizing it to work on your own operation. And that's where you talked a lot about regen ag, and there's also been a lot of discussion, and you can find it on LinkedIn, of people saying, this has become divisive at this point. And so you have to realize, do what works for your operation, share your story, share what you learn. And just know that there's always going to be someone critical of you, but you should also be critical of what you hear other people saying, including things I might have said, right? So
I couldn't
that would be
agree
my
more,
biggest thing, is
Rebecca.
just
I,
the
I
mindset.
couldn't agree more. Just phenomenal take. And I have people call me all the time. They go, I'd like to use your system, but I just want to let you know I do have a disc. And I go, okay. Let's so I'm like, "Well, why is that a big deal?" And maybe they don't want to use any herbicide, right? I'm like, well, this is good. Like, let's make it work for you. I always talk about this gentleman, Mr. Tim. He's a good friend of mine. He's in southeastern Ohio, and he didn't want to use any herbicide. And we came up with a plan that has worked for him, and he is just tickled pink with the results. He's seeing more wildlife. I think he's even used some of the stuff in his garden to increase soil fertility and stuff. And I'm like, and it started with this, like, I know you like no-till, and I do in a lot of situations, but there are times where it's like, okay, we have to come up with a different plan. And to your point of just seeing things, and looking at them and going, wait a second, does that make sense? And here's a quick example I'll leave listeners left. I was about 16 years old, and I thought I was like really smart, right? I thought this was like so brilliant. And I remember looking at barometric pressure readings relative to deer movement on cameras. And I thought, I'm going to create a correlation to every time I'm seeing deer and what's the barometric pressure. Because I had heard about these pressure changes.
Mm-hmm.
And I started looking at all this. I'm like, oh my gosh, every time I'm seeing deer, the pressure's at, I forget what it was, 30 or something like that. And then I came to realize that like the pressure in our region is during hunting season is like almost always around 30. So it ended up being like I could have presented that data and probably made it look really brilliant, right?
Mm-hmm.
But unless you understood that, like I remember Dad telling me, going,
Contact.
have you looked at what the baseline pressure? And I'm like, I was young and I thought, and it felt like so silly, but there's a lot out there that you can make something look so great. But if you don't have a baseline to really compare it to, is it really as good? And that's how our conversation kind of started. And again, thank you so much. This has been so awesome. I was bragging to my 3-year-old. I'm like, I get to talk to a scientist today. He thought it was so cool. And thank you again. Honestly, it was my total pleasure and honor to chat with you today.
No, thank you. And I appreciated the conversation. And I've learned a lot today too. And I do want to just add one more thing about the disc. My husband actually is a firefighter. We recently had a really big grass fire here in just outside of town, and we really appreciated all the farmers that come out with the discs and help. And you talked about the natural fire on the landscape and stuff. So everything's a tool. Sometimes it might sit in our shed and collect dust if we change our management practices, but you never know when you need to dust that tool off and get it. And so, yeah. Anyways, sorry. Thank you. It was so fun to talk to you, and fun emailing back and forth and getting to learn and use my wildlife brain again is kind of fun too. So,
Absolutely. I am sure we will be in touch again. Thank you so much.